Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and you're watching Redlines. Friend of the show, Professor Mohammad Marandi of the University of Tehran, just returned to Iran from a trip to Syria, where he had the opportunity to travel the Damascus-Aleppo Highway, a famous thoroughfare in the country which for years was occupied by foreign-backed extremist fighters, but is now operating once again thanks to victories by the Syrian military. As the war draws to a close in Syria, I spoke with Professor Marandi to get an update on the situation in the country and also asked him about the coronavirus spread in Iran. All that and more coming up. Nice to see you, Professor Marandi. You just returned from Aleppo and actually traveled all throughout Syria. You had the opportunity to actually drive along the Damascus-Aleppo Highway, which is now open thanks to advances made by the Syrian army. What did you see along the way?
Well, the Syrian army, with the help of its allies, the Iranian-led forces and the Russian Air Force, they were able to capture a huge amount of land, over 2,000 square kilometers, in a relatively short period of time. But what then happened was that these terrorist organizations, led by Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda, which is now called Hayat Tahrir Sham, it's been rebranded a few times. Previously it was the Nusra Front. Since they're losing the war, the Turkish armed forces and the Turkish government, which until now were behind the scenes supporting Al-Qaeda and other such groups, they now felt that they have to come in and fight directly against the Syrian armed forces. So now you have a huge number of Turkish troops fighting alongside Al-Qaeda on multiple fronts. It's absolutely extraordinary. So after the enormous progress that was made, there was a lull in the Russian Air Force and Russian support for reasons that we'll discover later, I'm sure. And the Turks, although they gave certain assurances, they started striking targets that included Lebanese targets, Hezbollah targets, and Iranian-led forces. And so the Turks began their counteroffensive alongside Al-Qaeda, and they retook some of the territory, and they were able to penetrate the highway. So when I was passing through the highway, that was the beginning of their counterattack to take because the extremists had the whole highway, and the government took it back, but they wanted to penetrate the highway, to take a piece of the highway, occupy a piece of the highway, to block it altogether. And we were passing by when they were carrying out that attack, and we saw a burning tank on the highway, which was hit, I guess, half an hour before we got there. So we drove by and went to Aleppo. But at the moment, the government has the upper hand, thanks to the resilience of the Syrian people and the support that the Iranians and the Russians are giving. But obviously, the support that the Americans, the Europeans, the Saudis, the Qataris have been giving to Turkey, and the Turks, their support for the different extremist groups in Aleppo, they are causing huge difficulty they continue to cause huge difficulty and suffering for the people of Syria.
How has this latest offensive in the war exposed the levels to which Turkey is coordinating with these armed extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda?
I think it's been obvious for those who've been following events closely for many years now. We know from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that Syrian neighboring countries and regional countries were supporting extremists to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. And we later found out through an interview by the head of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency at that time, General Michael Flynn, the famous Michael Flynn, where he said that a willful decision had been made by the United States to support these regional countries, which included Turkey. That was ISIS. So on the one hand, Turkey was supporting ISIS alongside with the Americans and the Saudis and the Qataris and European intelligence organizations, but they were also supporting other groups. And the evidence of that it has been open for people to see. We know it from the WikiLeaks documents. We know it from Biden's speech in Harvard in 2014, where he explicitly mentioned Turkey and President Erdogan and how they were supporting the extremists. And we know from also the former U.S. Secretary of State, Kerry, he was speaking to the so-called Syrian opposition in the UN building, and he was telling them, he admitted to them, he said openly to them that we allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus to put pressure on the government. And those Syrians who were among the opposition, no one said anything. No one complained. No one expressed surprise because they all knew it. This is an open secret. What is extraordinary is not that it is happening, but that Western media is completely silent about it. And they're covering up this reality. They call them rebels. But it's interesting that when the Turks and others use these, for example, Al-Qaeda or the Nusra Front against Syrians, they are rebels. But when the Turkish government was attacking the Kurds using these same groups, suddenly everyone was outraged, and the Western media was saying that Erdogan is using horrible extremists and how evil he is. And then when again he now uses these extremists against Syrians again, they're rebels and they're victims, and the Syrian government is evil. So anyone who follows the news closely can see through this whole facade quite easily.
You touched on this briefly, but what is your understanding regarding Russia's latest actions and decisions? Because I've seen some analysts questioning why exactly Russia kind of took a step back at this point. I know Russia has played the role of mediator throughout this conflict, although it's fought on the side of the Syrian military. Of course, it's still hosted peace talks between Turkey, Iran, Syria, and players in the region. So what is your read on Russia's actions here?
It's difficult to say, but apparently the Russians were speaking with the Turks and they agreed to halt the airstrikes, and also the air defenses were not activated. The Turks gave assurances not to strike certain areas, but they hit Hezbollah, they hit Iranian-led forces, they hit large numbers of Syrians during that window of opportunity. And after a day, a bit over a day, the Russians reversed their decision. Now, whether it was because the Russians wanted to give some concession to the Turks to come to some sort of agreement, or whether the Russians miscalculated, or whether the Russians just trusted the Turks too much, because many of the people who were murdered and killed by the Turkish drones, they were caught off guard. Otherwise, if the air defenses were activated, those drones could not have carried out those strikes. So
you're talking about Turkish drones carrying out attacks on Syrian territory in Idlib, offering protection essentially to the Al-Qaeda affiliate groups on the ground there.
Absolutely, yes, that's exactly what happened. Not only it's not just that they were supporting Al-Qaeda troops. In some areas, they're supporting Al-Qaeda troops, and in some areas, the Al-Qaeda troops are mixed with Turkish troops. And the Al-Qaeda troops are now wearing Turkish uniforms. So it's just amazing that a NATO country can be openly fighting another country, invading another country, and the Western media backs them completely, and so do Western think tanks. So no one says that this is outrageous that the Turkish armed forces have invaded a neighboring country, that they are fighting alongside Al-Qaeda. It's apparently the new norm, the new normal.
Can you discuss Turkey's historic role in the region and what exactly is driving Erdogan, President Erdogan at the moment? I hear many people say that he wants to reestablish the Ottoman Empire, that he's kind of a wannabe sultan. What do you make of those allegations, and what have his actions in Syria revealed regarding some of those ambitions?
I think we can look at Erdogan in, let's say, two phases. There are two phases here. One was after the Arab Spring, or the awakening, as some call it. He had ambitions because many of the groups that were coming to power or had come to power or who were gaining influence in different countries were associated with the Muslim Brotherhood or were branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, like in Egypt and in Tunisia. In Yemen, the Muslim Brotherhood was on the rise. In Jordan, it was on the rise. And then the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, which is the most extreme branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, was also staging an uprising which was quite violent. He was trying to gain influence because he too is a part of the Brotherhood, and so is his party, closely affiliated to the Brotherhood. He thought that he could gain influence in North Africa and in West Asia, and so he supported these groups in Syria, not only the Brotherhood, but other extremist groups, to bring down the Syrian government. So initially, I think it was a part of this larger Muslim Brotherhood project where he would be at the head of this whole project.
Mm-hmm.
After the Brotherhood failed because of their own foolishness, because they supported extremists, because they became associated with Wahhabi groups like in Egypt, they lost popularity, they were incompetent, they did deals with the Americans, with the Israelis, they had no principles, the leadership in Egypt. And they were also outmaneuvered because they failed to kick out all of the people in the military and judiciary and intelligence that were associated with the previous regime, the Mubarak regime. And so they were outmaneuvered because of their own foolishness, their own foolish policies, and the coup succeeded. And the dictatorship that we see in Egypt is in place as a result of those policies and as a result of those mistakes. So the Brotherhood began to lose ground across the board, and in Syria as well, because they were seen by the population as extreme, as violent. I've been to Syria many times over the past 10, 15 years, and after the violence in Syria began, I've been there 11 times, I think, from late 2012 till just last night. And even during the really dark days in 2012 and 13, the population in Syria, those Syrians who live in Syria, disliked the Turkish interference in their affairs. They hated the extremists that were being supported. And right now, I think it's reached a new peak. And the reason is the second phase. And then after the Muslim Brotherhood failed, it seems to me that Erdogan is speaking instead of speaking about the Muslim Brotherhood or supporting the Brotherhood project, he is speaking more and more about the Ottomans and the Ottoman role in the region. And this has outraged Syrians even further, because just a few days ago, he spoke about Syria being a part of the Ottoman sphere of influence, Turkey's sphere of influence, and Iraq as well. And Syrians, they were outraged after this speech. So now instead of focusing, at least in his public speeches, about the Brotherhood, he is speaking about Turkey's influence and that Turkey really owns the region because of the Ottoman Empire. And this is the policy is the same. They're still supporting extremist groups, just as they were in years past. But now the narrative has changed a bit, and this, I think, has even, as I said, made Syrians more hostile towards Turkey than before.
And from what I've gathered, Aleppo, which was one of the cities where you traveled during this trip to Syria, Aleppo used to sort of be the industrial hub of Syria and even the region. That's why this highway connecting the capital Damascus to Aleppo was so key and why the extremist groups held it for so long. But Turkey was able to essentially, through these proxy groups, severely damage the heart of Syrian industry and a major competitor in the region. Have you heard anything regarding that? And what is the current status of Aleppo at the moment? I know, for example, Turkey was even bombing the airport in the city over recent days.
Well, first I'd like to point out that if the people of Syria supported Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, the Syrian government would have fallen in 2012, 13, 14, during that period. Why? Because the extremists that were being funded by Saudi Arabia, countries in the Persian Gulf, Turkey, and who were being led from command centers in Turkey as well as in Jordan. Tens of thousands of foreign fighters were coming in from Turkey. They were coming in from Jordan. ISIS, which back then was the Islamic State of Iraq, was coming in from Iraq because the Saudis were supporting them against the Iraqi government. They came into Syria, and they were coming in from Lebanon. So Syria was being attacked from all sides. And then this huge media campaign was launched against Syria by the Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, all the Arabic news channels, hundreds of religious and secular TV channels, many of them enormously sectarian, extraordinarily sectarian, calling for the slaughter of minorities on TV channels that were broadcast on satellite. None of them were banned by any Western country or Arab country. So you had this huge media campaign, and powers, neighbors, superpowers, pouring in extremist troops, funding weapons to undermine the government. And the government didn't collapse. And Iranian support and Hezbollah support only began in 2013 after tens of thousands of foreign fighters had already entered the country and ISIS was on the rise.
And Russian support even later than that.
Russian support came in 2015, and that's when the Iranian general Soleimani, who was murdered by the Americans recently, he went to Moscow and convinced the Russians to bring in their air force. So if the Syrian government was the enemy of the people in the eyes of the overwhelming majority of Syrians, and these extremists, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the others, were supported by the public, there is no way that the government would have lasted. The reality is that Assad was loved by many people. He was liked by many people. Many people accepted him. Many people weren't fans of his, but they preferred him to what was on offer by the foreigners. So that brought the overwhelming majority of Syrians together. Syrians who, from those who liked him a lot and those who were critical of him but didn't want the extremists. And that prevented the country from falling, despite this huge campaign against the country. So one of the things that the Americans did by creating ISIS with, through Saudi Arabia, the Turks, and so on, as We see from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, where General Flynn, who was the head of the organization, admitted that the United States took a willful decision to help these regional regimes to create this Salafist, this extremist entity between Syria and Iraq, which was later ISIS. The reason why they wanted to create ISIS between Syria and Iraq was to prevent Syria from trade. They wanted to strangle the country. Mm-hmm. And the reason why the extremists have been trying very hard to keep the road to Aleppo closed is also to strangle the Syrian economy, because as you pointed out, Aleppo was the industrial center of the city. And when Western Aleppo was liberated, I was in Aleppo at that time. I went to the West Aleppo, which was always in the hands of the government, and I was on campus. They have a huge campus there. Immediately after East Aleppo was liberated. And I went and stayed in the industrial zone in eastern Aleppo for 3 days in a building. Everything had been taken to Turkey. All the factories, all the equipment over the last 2-3 years before the liberation of East Aleppo, everything had been taken by these Al-Qaeda groups and sold in Turkish families. And there was a factory owner who had some high-tech equipment, and he said that I know, because of the software on the machines that he had, I know exactly where my machines are in Turkey and that they're being used by Turkish factories. So they tried to strangle Aleppo in order to strangle the economy, just as right now the Europeans and the Americans, by imposing sanctions on Syria, are trying to strangle the economy. So part of these military assaults, whether it was by creating ISIS between Iraq and Syria, or by blocking the road to Aleppo, or by the sanctions where the Americans and the Europeans prevent gasoline and fuel from being brought into the country, all of these are meant to bring down the economy, to create misery for ordinary people. And this, of course, is alongside the bloody war that these groups have been engaged in.
It certainly is a targeted campaign against Syria's economy. I remember I was in occupied Palestine, I think in 2017. I was in Hebron in the West Bank, and there was a vendor there who was selling these beautiful robes and carpets, and he was telling me that they used to come from Syria, and he said that I got the best products from Aleppo, and I loved selling them, but now I get them from Jordan because the war has devastated the supply chain. And so that was, for me, an interesting story to kind of put it in perspective, the regional impact the war had, and that, again, this is the intended result of U.S. policy there. Aleppo became infamous in Western media in 2016, I believe, when the Syrian army and its allies fought to retake the parts of the city occupied by extremists. We were constantly told that the Syrian government was bombing hospitals and targeting civilians, but we're told little else. Who do people, or what do people in Aleppo actually blame for the violence there?
Well, there are a couple of interesting things that I think happened. One is, as I said, I was in Aleppo during the liberation of East Aleppo, and I stayed there for, I think, 3 days. And I also went to Mosul in Iraq immediately after the liberation of the city. And I think we were the first group that went to the central mosque, the Nuri Mosque, if I'm not mistaken, in Mosul. And the Americans had destroyed Mosul through bombing. So the Russians carried out extensive bombing in eastern Aleppo. There's no doubt about that. But of course, these extremist groups were in charge. They were holding the city. And there was no, they had to be, the real guilty party are those countries that helped Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates to take these cities and Aleppo. They're the real, otherwise ultimately you're going to have to expel them. Now, if we say that the Russians bombed the city and that is outrageous, Well, the Americans did the exact same thing in Mosul. In fact, the Americans did much worse in Raqqa, in a Syrian city where they, if you recall, ultimately they let the ISIS, the remnants of the ISIS force there to leave on buses and go to eastern Syria. The Americans let them escape. That city was destroyed. In fact, I was at a conference in Seoul, and a female officer from the U.S. military was saying the same thing, that the Russians, what they did in Aleppo was outrageous. And I said, well, how about your bombings in Raqqa? And she said, yes, I accept that. The city was totally destroyed. And I didn't see Raqqa, but I saw Mosul. And on the other hand, regardless of the bombings of eastern Aleppo, which happened, the airstrikes, but if you just count the number of hospitals that were allegedly bombed, I don't think you have that many hospitals in the whole of the United States.
Right. Well, we were constantly hearing it was the last hospital. It was the last hospital. How many last hospitals can you have?
Exactly. So the number of hospitals equaled the number of hospitals in the United States. The number of last hospitals, I think, equaled the number of hospitals in a state in the United States. So it was they were constantly bombing the last hospital. So that's just revealing of Western media propaganda. So if what the Syrian government, the Iranians of course didn't bomb Aleppo. Their air force wasn't involved. It was the Syrian and the Russian air force. But if what the Russians and the Syrians did in Aleppo was wrong, well, the Americans were doing the same thing. But the Western media was not complaining about that. But the only difference is that the Western media was ignoring the fact that the extremists, both in Mosul, where the Americans bombed, and in Aleppo, where the Syrians and the Russians bombed, were funded and supported by the United States, the Saudis, the Turks, the EU, and oil-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region. So the real guilty partner, the real guilty side in all this, is those countries that, it's just like the Contra rebels. I mean, when the Contra rebels were killing people in Nicaragua, I'm sure the Nicaraguan armed forces, when they were retaking towns and villages, civilians were killed. But who do you blame? Do you blame the Nicaraguan armed forces for reasserting their sovereignty? Or do you blame the United States and neighboring countries and those extremist rebels who were destroying the country and invading the country? There's no comparison. There's no moral equivalence here.
It's a bit like treating cancer with a heavy amount of radiation or chemotherapy, except in this case, some of the doctors deciding to get involved and treat the cancer are actually the doctors who put it there in the first place.
Yes, and I would like to add here, though, that Iranian tactics in war are different from Russian tactics. So, for example, when the Iranians took the city of Tikrit in Iraq, the city was not damaged. And this was Saddam Hussein's hometown. And I'm sure you know quite well how Iranians feel about Saddam Hussein. So the damage was minimal. But the Americans, in order to prevent their own, but Iranians gave more casualties as a result, because when you go into a city,
man-to-man combat?
Yes, exactly. But the Americans, they just simply destroy cities to prevent losses among their troops. And the Russians, while their bombing was not as, by admission of Americans, when you compare Raqqa to eastern Aleppo, the Russians, while their bombing was not as devastating as the American bombings, but at the end of the day, they were bombing extremist groups that were the ones who carried out 9/11. and the United States and their allies were supporting these groups and continue to support these groups that are responsible for 9/11 in the United States. So again, it's just the argument that Western media makes is outrageous. It's utter nonsense. The guilt lie. It's like saying when they constantly say Assad killed 500,000 of his own people. Like, well, he was walking around just killing
Yeah.
people. Eh,
Right.
if anyone, to be very blunt, and I'm sure some of your viewers will dislike what I say, if anyone is a monster, it's the US president, whether the current president or the previous president who supported these groups. Because if it wasn't for their support, none of this would have happened. Maybe a few people would have been killed in demonstrations. The Syrian police may have been at fault. A couple of generals may have been at fault, or maybe they had committed crimes. Maybe senior officials in the Syrian government were responsible for the deaths of innocent people, but it would have been 10, 20, 30, 50 at most. No worse than what we saw in Egypt. When the Egyptians were killing protesters on the streets, no one called for the overthrow of the Egyptian government. In fact, the Americans initially tried to keep Mubarak in power, and
Yeah,
then
they
the
said
generals in power.
Mubarak was firmly in place.
Yes.
He had nothing
Or
to
when
worry about.
or when the Turks were attacking the Kurds in Turkey, not more recently in Syria, where Western media was outraged by because they were using these groups that are now being supported by the Western media. But earlier on, 3-4 years ago, when the Turkish government was attacking cities in Turkish uh, areas that were predominantly Kurdish, populated by Kurds, they destroyed towns and villages, but no one complained about that. I'm not saying that the Syrian government is benign, that it is some sort of utopia, but the crimes committed by the coalition that the United States built, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, and according to the admission of the head of that organization at the time, General Michael Flynn, on Al Jazeera of all places, the
Yeah.
crimes
I,
committed the crimes committed by this coalition are incomparable to anything carried out from inside the country.
this goes back to an earlier point you were making, but when I was in Syria, people told me that even some of the people was talking to said when the demonstrations first began, they were maybe indifferent or even interested in some sort of civil, peaceful uprising, but they within days saw how international media, especially regional media, Al Jazeera and others, were responding to it and could then see pretty quickly that something was really wrong and that this wasn't just an organic, peaceful movement, that there were people ready to take advantage of it or planning to take advantage of it from the very beginning. And you mentioned this as well, the fact that for years now, as the Syrian military has won back territory, it's placed fighters in order to essentially avoid the bloodbath mainstream media constantly accuses the Syrian military of carrying out anyway. But in order to avoid that, they would put groups of extremists on green buses and drive them from wherever they were, Aleppo, Raqqa, and put them in Idlib. This is the territory now where they've been gathering for years. That's why the largest Al Qaeda affiliate in the history of the group since 9/11 is established in Idlib today. Where are all of these fighters going to go now? What is your understanding of that? Obviously, some of them will die fighting the Syrian military, but I doubt it's going to go down to the last man here.
Well, that's a very good question, because many of these foreign fighters are going to try to go back to their home countries, and then it's going to be a huge intelligence problem for the intelligence agencies of these countries. And of course, if they carry out attacks, Muslims will again be blamed, and people in the West will not be told or reminded that these groups were supported by Western government and the Western media. these extremists when they carried out these attacks, when they were being trained, when they were being funded, when they were being given ideological training by Wahhabi groups. They were being supported by Western governments. So, but ultimately, ordinary Muslims are going to be blamed for something that Western governments are responsible for. But I'd like to also point something out that goes back to the beginning of what happened in Syria. The difference between Syria and the dictatorships in Egypt and Tunisia and during the so-called Arab Spring or the Awakening or whatever, was that these regimes were controlled by the United States. They were client regimes. Syria had an independent foreign policy. And the Syrian president was popular because of that, because he was able to help Lebanon win the war against Israel in 2006, because he was able to resist the Israelis from pushing forward or imposing a peace deal, an unfair peace deal on Syria. So when these protests took place, and many of them, the protests were people who just wanted a better life, the protesters many of them weren't calling for the overthrow of the government. There were two groups. Then those who were the extremists, the radicals, or not radicals, but the extremists, they were Wahhabi, and they began to chant sectarian slogans, and they were very hateful and violent. And as a result, many of the protesters quit the protests because of them. And also pro-government protesters were very large in number, but they were not being reported. They were actually much larger in Damascus and Aleppo and in other cities, but they were not being reported in the Western media because it didn't suit their narrative. But when the fighting began, the Western media again, and also the government, the Arabic media that's controlled by oil-rich dictatorships, were all saying that the regime is gunning down people. So the Arab League, which is controlled by these oil-rich dictatorships, they sent a delegation to Syria, led by a Sudanese general who was the ambassador in Doha, Qatar. They went, and the Arab League mission stayed in Syria, and they filed a report. In the report, they said that there is a third force in Syria. And you can find the report online, but since it didn't suit the narrative, the mission was completely discredited and the report was ignored. But if your viewers check, they can find it online. It was online at least a year or two ago. I have a link to it in a couple of my articles. They said that there was a third force firing at both the Syrian government forces and the protesters. And this is something that the Syrian government was saying all along, but the media was saying they're lying, these are conspiracy theories, they're justifying their brutality. But this mission, which was sent by the Arab League, and which was by no means sympathetic to the Syrian government, and the Syrians allowed them in, and the head of the mission, as I said, was the former Sudanese, a general who was the Sudanese ambassador to Qatar, Doha. He was the head of that mission. So when you look at the narrative more closely, the Western media, Western think tanks, and Western governments have been giving us a false narrative all along, a very misleading narrative all along. And I know I know a lot of Western media, let's say reporters and well-known people, some of them people who you've heard their names or you've met. In private, when I speak with them, sometimes initially they argue for a few minutes, but then they all agree that the story of Syria is not what's being said in the Western media. And what we've been talking about over the last, 30 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, is the real story. But these same people in private discussions will say one thing to me or admit one thing to me, but in their articles and on television, they go back to this old narrative, this repetitive narrative of the rebels and the regime murdering all the civilians and the rebels, needing support and what we've been hearing day and night for years now.
There's no way you can escape the true story if you actually go to the ground and speak to average people there, because you can't find a large amount of people who will corroborate the U.S. corporate media line or the Qatari media line. They just can't. You're going to find some guy on the street who says, I was living my life in my neighborhood happily one day, and then armed men who weren't even from there came in, took over our homes, and began terrorizing us. I mean, that was their reality. There's just no question. One other question.
Just one thing. Right now in Syria, as I said, because of what Erdogan has been saying about the Ottomans and that these countries and these cities in Syria and in Iraq are a part of our sphere of influence, and basically he was saying they're ours. Whether you like or dislike your government, what person in any country would accept a foreign leader speaking like that about their country?
Right.
So no one in the world.
An empire of the past saying it wants to come to life and swallow you whole.
Yes, and that is what Erdogan is saying. And so it's obvious that the people of Syria despise him and his policies in the country. It would be the same anywhere on this earth. If people in one country that were under subjugation from another country were to hear that the ruler of that country wants to repeat that subjugation or revive that subjugation again, they would resist. Yet the Western think tanks and officials and media and they all pretend as if these extremist groups that are fighting for a foreign power or foreign powers, that they somehow have legitimacy inside Syria. So when Turkey invades Syria, they don't call it an invasion. Just like when the Israeli regime bombs Syria, it's a violation of international law. But it's just normal. It's okay.
To jump in and ask you about Israel specifically, as we're on the topic of land, wanting to restore the Ottoman Empire in the region, but also the war on Syria, have people spoken with you about the question of Israeli and Turkish coordination during this latest round of fighting? Because I noticed Israel increased its bombing campaign against the capital Damascus, and a Syrian journalist I had on last week suggested that there is some sort of cooperation between the Israeli and Turkish militaries on this front.
Well, actually, the first night when I arrived in Damascus, about 10 days ago, I was in my room when the Israelis carried out their strike, and of course it didn't receive any attention in the Western media.
Was that when they targeted the airport?
That's when they killed a couple of Palestinians, and they also struck a number of bases. It was, I think, Thursday night.
It is remarkable that this gets no coverage.
And it gets no coverage. Of course, the Israelis exaggerate. For example, they keep saying they strike Iranian targets, but they don't strike any Iranian targets. They strike Syrian targets, but they say Iranian in order to justify it. But even if they were Iranian targets, which they weren't, none of it. Only once did they really strike an Iranian target, and that was the T4 airbase. That was 2-3 years ago, where they murdered 7 Iranian soldiers. But other than that, it's just they've been striking out at Syrians, but saying Iran. But even if they were Iranians, again, the Iranians are there at the invitation of the legitimate government in Damascus. So it's they have no right to strike anything in Syria. But again, in the West, it's fine if the Israelis do it. But during the fighting in Syria, ISIS held territory alongside the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is a part of Syria that, as you know, is occupied by the Israeli regime. Alongside the Golan Heights towards the Lebanese border was occupied by ISIS. And to the south, to the north towards the Lebanese border, it was occupied by Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates. And to the south towards the Jordanian border by ISIS. And the Israelis tolerated these groups for years.
And they were never attacked.
They were never attacked, and the Israelis actually gave them weapons, especially Al-Qaeda. And the head of Mossad admitted that we would help them, and we would deal with their injured and take them to hospitals. And the head of the Israeli military intelligence said that we prefer ISIS to Assad, the Syrian president. So the Israelis were, just like the Turkish government, they were supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and like the Americans and like the Saudis and the others. They were all a part of this. They were all coordinating with Americans. If they were not coordinating with one another, at the end of the day, it was the Americans who were leading this campaign. Now many of these countries are tired. The Syrians have recaptured most of the territory. There's very little left. The only areas that are left are really occupied by Turkey. All the other areas have been more or less liberated, except for small pockets where ISIS is still embedded, and that's because the Americans don't allow ISIS to be destroyed. When the Americans would bomb Iraqi soldiers, they just did a couple of months ago, if you recall, they were on the front lines in the fight against ISIS. The Americans want to keep the road between Syria and Iraq blocked to keep the economic pressure on Syria maximum.
That's why the U.S. has this Al-Tanf military base.
That's right. That's right. They wanted to block the road, and then the Americans outflanked the Iranians outflanked the Americans, and they created a bridge between Syria and Iraq. But the Americans are allowing ISIS to thrive in that area to keep that road insecure. So ultimately, these countries are tired. Syria has gained the upper hand, and now these countries don't want to support Turkey as much as before, because they're still supporting Turkey, but they're not going to invest in it like before. The Saudis have enormous problems with Yemen. The Yemenis are making huge gains over the past few days. They also had huge successes against the Saudis. The Emiratis have problems. The Qataris, everyone has. This is not like 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. They're all in a lot of trouble. Europe is
Israel too.
And Israel is in trouble. Europe is in trouble. So Erdogan is more or less on his own now. So while they're giving lip service and they're supporting Al-Qaeda, the Western media, Western think tanks, Western governments, but they're not really able to do much. So at the moment, it's a lost cause. He is losing the battle, but we'll have to see what happens in the coming days.
While Israel didn't achieve its objective of regime change in Damascus, it was after years and years of this war, this aggression against Syria, that the United States moved to recognize the Golan Heights officially as Israeli territory. I don't think that would have happened without this war, which is why I find it so ironic that many people who claim to support Palestinians in the United States were very vocal in support of a war against Syria and really threw the government and the people there under the bus. While I have you on the line, Professor Marandi, I wanted to ask you, because you're an Iranian, and in Iran, something else that we're hearing a lot about in the United States right now is the rise of the coronavirus in the country, and it seems to have hit Iran particularly hard. I just wanted to ask you for an update on the situation there. What do people think about the spread of this COVID-19 virus in Iran at the moment?
Well, there are a number of things. And one is that the Persian language media that's run or owned or supported by Western governments are trying to create fear in the country. So they spread rumors, and they're carrying it's a very dirty campaign. BBC Persian, Deutsche Welle Persian, VOA Persian,
exaggerating
by these outlets. Yes, by exaggerating, by spreading rumors, by constantly trying to create fear among Iranians and mistrust. So while, for example, the BBC, the BBC for the British population is calling on people to be calm and for the British to be not to be worried, the Persian service is doing as much as possible to create fear in the country and to spread rumors. The situation in Iran is difficult, but it is not what you hear in the Western media. The country is not falling apart. There are not hundreds of dead people and that sort of thing. But the government is struggling. But one reason why it's struggling is because of the illegal U.S. sanctions.
Of course.
Because the Iranians are having difficulty bringing in the equipment that they need because they need a huge amount of material to deal with this problem. But they're having problems bringing it in, and the Americans are blocking it, and so are the Europeans and their allies by obeying the Americans. So if the virus spreads in Iran, it's largely due to the Americans. And if it spreads to other countries from Iran, again, the Americans, the Europeans, they bear responsibility for imposing these sanctions. So the situation is not nearly as dire and awful and as is being said in the Western media, but it's difficult, and people have died. The role of the Persian language media, funded, owned by the West, is shameful, and these people should be in jail. And it's in complete contrast to the way in which the same media outlets are treating the English versions, are treating their own local populations, where they're trying to keep the people in England and in Europe calm and so on. So it's a part of this dirty war. It's whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Iran or Afghanistan, this is how the empire functions. The mainstream media, the corporate media, is in bed with the power, with the deep state and the leaders of the country. Of course, the divisions in the United States because of Trump, they are real. But when it comes to U.S. interest, the interests of the deep state, of this political establishment, they're very similar. Trump, as you know, said one thing before the election about this region, and he did something completely different. He said we're going to, that the war in Syria is none of our business. He said that, although he's known to be dishonest, but he was absolutely correct when he said Obama created ISIS. He was deeply involved in the creation of ISIS, as the documents show. As Biden's speech at Harvard in 2014, as I said earlier, the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, his speech, his discussion with the Syrian opposition at the UN building reveal, as Hillary Clinton's emails reveal, the United States was deeply involved in creating ISIS, and Trump was true. What he said was true. And when Trump said that Iran and the Russians are fighting ISIS, that was true. But now suddenly everything has reversed. Now that he's in power, he's pursuing very similar policies. And I don't want to speak about the false flag operations, the chemical attacks, because I know you've covered that extensively elsewhere. So, the accusations made against the Syrian government, without investigating, they carry out missile attacks, the Americans, the French, and the British, and later on it's revealed, as expected, that something very different happened, and it wasn't the Syrian government. In fact, when the Americans would strike those targets, saying that these were where the chemical weapons came from, those strikes would actually create a catastrophe if there were really chemical weapons being held in those places. If you strike the chemical weapons, then the whole city will be devastated as a result. But they knew there were no chemical weapons. They knew that the Syrian government had not carried out those attacks. They knew that there were no chemical weapons being stored where the Tomahawk missiles and other missiles struck. And the cover-up that you've covered, I don't want to get into because I think your audience knows pretty much what happened. And if they don't, they can easily figure it out.
Yes, and my colleague Aaron Mate has done wonderful coverage on the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, reports, leakers now, whistleblowers coming out and saying that they were pressured to hide evidence which would suggest the Syrian government was not responsible for chemical attacks. So I'm interested in what you've said about the coronavirus as well, because I think it is the opposite of what we're getting here, where I have the feeling that the situation in the U.S. is much worse than our government and our media are letting on. But in the meantime, in Iran, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is saying they're worried about the spread of coronavirus there. If he were seriously concerned, obviously the first thing he could do is end U.S. sanctions, which are targeting the country, creating a terrible humanitarian situation. And I fear for other countries as well. Venezuela, for example, that have had their health systems targeted by the United States. So we'll continue to hope that the situation doesn't get worse, and I will stay in touch with you as well to monitor developments in the region. Professor Mohammad Marandi, it's always nice to talk to you.
It's always nice to talk to you too.